go to the next slide? Okay, sure. So thank you for this opportunity to sharing some thoughts on the Eli Lilly's oral drug in the just in the past months. I think in the past months we saw the stock market up and down like dramatically for Eli Lilly's stock. So what happened? So I think August 6th, early this month, Eli Lilly released their ATTAIN-1 top line result, and their stock price dropped 40%, which marks the largest single day loss for their company. So as we can see from this graph here, you can really see the kind of a significance drop there. And so let's just look closely at what happened. So what what is ATTAIN-1? So ATTAIN-1 is basically part of the Eli Lilly's oral GLP-1 receptor agonist global development program. So in this ambitious development program, they have five achieve studies focusing on type 2 diabetes patients, and two ATTAIN studies focusing on the obesity patients. So ATTAIN-1 is one of the obesity patients focusing trials. So ATTAIN-1 is basically a pivotal trial to investigate the once daily oral GLP-1 receptor agonist, so-called the Orforglipron. They compare that so they basically use different dose levels and they investigate the treatment effect in patients with obesity, but without type 2 diabetes. So if we look at the top line result here, so they shared in their press release, so we can see that. So in the first dose level here, the 36 milligram of glipron, so we can see a 12.4% mean percent change in the body weight from the baseline. And this is actually a very promising result, but it's a little bit lower than what the market expected. So the market, I think in the beginning, they expected to see about 50% weight loss. Maybe we can go to the next page to see why the market had a very high expectation for this clinical trial. So we can look at the history from Eli Lilly itself and also from the competitor companies, Novo Nordisk as well. So the first study we can see on the left is called Estimand 5 study, which is a pivotal trial to compare the tirzepatide to the semaglutide. So this is a head-to-head study to compare the injectable GLP-1 receptor agonist. So this is also in patients with obesity but no type 2 diabetes. So as we can see from this graph here, which they shared in the New England Journal of Medicine in July of this year. So as we can see from these two bars here, so their own drug tirzepatide achieved about 20% weight loss compared to that about 13.7% in the semaglutide group. And so basically, this result shows that the tirzepatide is better than the semaglutide, and Eli Lilly may have better formula to mix their drugs. So there's another trial, which is the OASIS-1 study conducted by Novo Nordisk, and this is a pivotal trial as well to investigate the oral semaglutide once daily formula in adults with obesity but no type 2 diabetes as well. So as we can see from this figure here, which they shared 2 years ago in Lancet, as we can see in the treatment groups, oral semaglutide group, 50 milligram group, they showed a 15.1% weight loss from the baseline. So basically, so from these two drugs, I think the market expected the oral drug from Eli Lilly again can achieve some kind of comparable effect compared to the oral semaglutide effect, and it potentially could narrow down the gap between the oral and the injectable GLP-1 receptor agonist, because these are new oral drug from Eli Lilly. They have the new mechanism of action, so they have the non-peptide kind of a So they are non-peptide and they have the unique binding model to GLP-1 receptor. So the market expected to see a at least a comparable effect to the oral semaglutide. So can we go to the next page, please? So let's look closely at the Orforglipron development program for obesity patients. So basically, there are uh, three studies here. So the first one is a phase 2 study. I think Eli Lilly has published their results in New England Journal of Medicine 2 years ago. So basically, they investigated the oral drug in adults with obesity but no type 2 diabetes, and their primary endpoint is a mean percent change in body weight from baseline at week 26. So I think they investigated different those levels, and they only used so-called the efficacy estimand. And we can explain more about the estimand and the efficacy estimand later. So there are two other studies, so-called ATTAIN-1 and ATTAIN-2 studies. So the ATTAIN-1 is in adults with obesity but without the type 2 diabetes. ATTAIN-2 is in adults with both obesity and type 2 diabetes. So they both investigated the mean percent change in body weight from baseline at week 72, and they used a a kind of a lower dose levels compared to the first phase 2 trials. I think most likely because some safety issues, and they may think the lower dose may have a better safety profile and with relatively comparable efficacy results. And so recently, in their two press releases, they they shared their top line results. And as we can see in the table here, this is from the phase 2 trial from New England Journal of Medicine. As you can see from the title of this table, so this is primary and secondary endpoints in the efficacy estimand, and also from the other two tables. I think if you click, we can see the other two tables as well. So this table and another table, they both from their press release, and they focused on the efficacy estimand as well. So one question here I like to explain to the audience is what is estimand and what is efficacy estimand, how it compared to other estimands, and how this will impact our understanding of these results. Can you go to the next page, please? So So Estimand is also, it's basically a concept which stems from the SH-R1 addendum. So they released the SH-R1 addendum in 2021. So this is basically a language or framework that can help different stakeholders in clinical trials to define the treatment effects clearly. So let's just use one example from their training materials. So let's consider a trial in the type 2 diabetes. So the objective or the scientific question of interest could be, what is the treatment difference between the treatment group and the no treatment group on the HbA1c at week 24? So let's think about that. What could happen in the clinical practice or maybe in the clinical trial as well? So some patients, they probably can tolerate the drug and they can continue to use the drug. But for some other patients, they may not be able to tolerate the drug because of a lot of like safety issues. And they may just leave the clinical trial, or they may kind of discontinue themselves from the use of the medicine. And how do we treat these patients will may lead to different summary of the treatment effects. So let's think about these patients here. As you can see um, from the lower pane of this graph here. So if we summarize the treatment difference between groups on HbA1c at week 24, regardless of the adherence issue, which means whether the patient is able to remain on treatment or not. We don't care about that. We just collect their results at week 24 and compare the treatment effects between two groups. So that's one treatment measure. That's one treatment effect measure. And another way could be we can consider a hypothetical scenario where all the patients could adhere to the treatment. So which means we may need to impute some data to some patients who cannot tolerate the drug. And we use the imputed data and the observed data together to estimate the treatment effect. between the treatment groups. So that's another treatment effect measure. And so we can also restrict ourselves to the subgroup of the patients who can tolerate the treatment, and we can just focus on this subgroup of patients and estimate the treatment effect inside this subgroup. So that's also another treatment measure, treatment effect measure. So the same thing applies to another typical issue happen in clinical trial, which is some additional medication. That's so-called concomitant medicine. Uh, for instance, the rescue medication during the clinical trial, if the treatment doesn't work in the clinical trial, the patient may need to take some rescue medication. Um, and So that also happens when some safety issue happens, then the patient needs to take the rescue medication as well. So once this scenario happens, how do we handle that? It also could lead to different types of treatment effect measures, as we explained before. So all these types of issues like adhere, adherence or some additional medication use, all these are called intercurrent events. So can you go to next page? So these are called intercurrent events. And how do we handle these intercurrent events could lead to different summary of treatment effects. So SH in R1. So can you go to the next page, please? So SH in R1 addendum, they basically introduces 5 different strategies that can be used alone or in combination to handle these different intercurrent events. So the first one is called the treatment policy. Basically means we can disregard the treatment adherence and its rescue medication use. And so this treatment policy strategy aligns with the clinical practice or the so-called intention to treat principle. So this is very close to what we can observe in the clinical practice. And another strategy is called hypothetical strategy, which assumes the perfect adherence and no rescue medication use. And this is aligning with the so-called pure treatment effect or the pharmacologic effect. It's kind of the treatment effect purely from the drug. So then if we look at these uh, clinical trials from Eli Lilly again, then we can see that in their phase 2 trial, they only use the efficacy estimand because they are, I think they did not kind of intended to use this phase 2 trial for any submission, so they did not specify the treatment policy or any other estimand in their protocol, so they only report the efficacy estimand. So efficacy estimand basically means we handle or address the intercurrent events under a hypothetical scenario. We assume no intercurrent events happens. This is a kind of estimate the pure treatment effect. And in another 2 ATTAIN studies, they pre-specified 2 estimands in their protocols. So the first is called treatment regimen, and the second is called efficacy estimand. The treatment regimen estimand basically aligns with the treatment policy in the current events handling strategy, and the efficacy estimand aligns with the hypothetical strategy. Basically, treatment policy is very close to the ITT principle, and the hypothetical strategy close to the pure treatment effect. Can we go to next page, please? So once we have the estimand language, estimand knowledge in mind, so let's review the trial results again from the estimand perspective. So there are 3 studies from the Orforglipron clinical development program, and also we have 2 OASIS studies for the oral semaglutide. So for the phase 2 trial for Orforglipron, they did not use the treatment regimen estimand. So that's in the Eli Lilly's language. They call that treatment regimen estimand, and in Novo Nordisk's language, they call that treatment policy estimand. And they only reported the efficacy estimand for the phase 2 trial, which we can see they achieved about like 12% weight loss compared to the baseline. And in another 2 ATTAIN studies, So what happened is they achieved about like 11.2 or 9.6%. It's basically 10% weight loss compared to the baseline. That's in the treatment regimen estimand, which I do think is more important than the efficacy than the efficacy estimand. And I think most likely Eli Lilly going to use the treatment regimen estimand results for the US FDA submission. And I think I also see that in other related Eli Lilly studies, they mentioned that the efficacy estimand will only be used for the kind of a journal article publication, or maybe use the submission in the rest of the world, but not for the US FDA submission. And based on the OASIS 1 and 4 studies, we can see in these two studies, the oral semaglutide achieved a higher weight loss. It's about 15.1% in the obesity patients in OASIS 1 study. In another OASIS 4 study, a lower dose level, 25 milligram achieved a 13.6% weight loss compared to the baseline. So as we can see clearly, the treatment regimen estimand relatively achieved a lower treatment effect compared to the efficacy estimand, because the efficacy estimand, we kind of get rid of some intercurrent effects impact, and we are estimating the so-called pure treatment effect, or the so-called pharmacologic treatment effect. So so we should expect a higher effect under this estimate. But if we look at their protocol clearly, we can see that for these two oral semaglutide study, both studies, they required diet and physical activity counseling, which is not required in the Orforglipron studies, which is, I think, is a very appealing feature for the Orforglipron drug. So my conclusion is that both ATTAIN studies met their primary and secondary endpoints, though the weight lowering effect is not as good as expected. However, the Orforglipron does not require being on diet and working out, which is very appealing to the patients. And we can see from this graph here, the market is kind of getting back their confidence of Eli Lilly's products. So after the first press release of ATTAIN-1, August 6, the market their stock price dropped significantly, and after that, I think the market kind of digesting and kind of analyzing their results, and they are kind of getting back the confidence. And once after Eli Lilly released their ATTAIN-2 results, which looks kind of lower than ATTAIN-1, but we need to recall that ATTAIN-2 is for patients with obesity and type 2 diabetes. We know that for type 2 diabetes, it's very hard to reduce their body weight. So I think after that, their stock price increases a lot. So that's kind of concludes my presentation today.
Yeah, thank you.